Thank you, Alan. You'll see from the title slide here, we've got a question mark over the COVID virus. And one of the questions we had last year was the COVID virus a factor in our fatality rates in 2020? And we made a determination at that time that it was, and particularly in the 2-year-olds. And as you may recall, when we talked last year that in New York alone, the fatality rate in 2-year-olds for that year was 25% of our total fatalities. And in 2021, it's down to 12%, which is more like normal of what it's been over the past few years. So it looks very much like that was a temporary risk factor. And I'm pleased to see that the EID data was released yesterday. And in that report by Dr. Park, and he pointed out that COVID factor was a factor not just in New York, but across the nation. So I think we are happy to see that put behind us. And let's take a look at 2021. Andy, could I have next slide, please? So the big picture from 2012 to 2021 is a continued decrease in the number of total fatalities. And this is all causes. This is not just racing, but racing, training, and non-exercise related fatalities are continuing to decrease, since 2012. You can see the dip that happened in 2020, but it's interesting that there was obviously a big decrease in number of starts, but ironically, there was a slight increase in the number of fatalities in certain age groups, particularly the 2-year-olds. So nonetheless, I think the big picture here is one that we can all take to heart, that we're continuing to decrease the number of fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region throughout this whole period. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, this was a little bit interesting. We look at these fatalities when we sort them by activities. This is just a comparison between 2020 and 2021. And what we can see is that the most significant change, there was a fairly significant increase in racing fatalities in the past year. Training fatalities were down just a little bit. That may not be significant. And the other fatalities, these are non-exercise related fatalities, were down a little bit as well. But when we see an increase in racing fatalities per 1,000 starts, that's an area that we need to pick our heads up and say, well, we need to take a look at that and figure out what's going on. Next slide, please, Andy. So when we look at the Mid-Atlantic starts, you've seen this slide before, that the number of starts in our region has definitely decreased. And so given the number of starts going down, one might expect the number of fatalities to go down to some degree about that. But let's take a look at the next slide, Andy. So while we had a 22% decrease in the number of starts, we had a 40% decrease in the number of fatalities. What that means is that the decrease in fatalities is due to factors other than the decreased number of starts alone. So these are risk factor modulations or interventions that have been put in place over the years that have helped to reduce these fatalities above and beyond the number of decrease simply because we're racing fewer starts. Next slide, Andy. This is a comparison that we've done for many years now between the Mid-Atlantic fatality rate and the national EID fatality rate from 2010 to 2021. And I think you can see that there was a pretty good gap initially between the Mid-Atlantic rate, which is in blue, and the national fatality rate, which is in orange. And then by the time you get down to 2016, it's pretty consistently the same, slightly above. Last year it was below the national rate. This year it's slightly above the national rate. But my point is that I think that, again, this shows that the work that we've done in the Mid-Atlantic group has really helped to improve our fatality rates, or decrease our fatality rates, actually, but to do better than we have been in the past by continued focus on these issues and things that we can do to make it better. Next slide, please, Andy. So in summarizing then, our general fatality rate is a 39% drop since 2014. The total number of fatalities did go up a little bit in 2021. And this is, I just want to mention this is never a time when we point fingers at anybody. I think, though, that there was an awful lot of publicity about the Laurel Racetrack surface issues that came about this year. There was a big number in Maryland. Maryland's fatality numbers would have been significantly less if there wouldn't have been some kind of a incident down there where there was challenges with getting the racetrack surface, tuned up properly. And I know Glenn Kozak went down there and was instrumental in getting that squared away. But I just want to point out that when we monitor things like this and we have our strategic plan to reduce fatalities, it doesn't mean that there won't be spikes or that there won't be moments when we're going to have an issue that we need to address. But what it does mean is that when those things happen, we have systems in place to address those problems and try to make sure they don't happen again. That's a really important take-home message about this fatality risk management program. We did see an increase in racing fatalities a bit there, and we need to look at that and figure out what else might. It wasn't all about Laurel Racetrack, so we need to take a deep look, a deep dive on that, see what that was. But these are areas that deserve scrutiny. Next slide, please, Andy. So we do know now that COVID-19 was a risk factor in 2020, and it was nationwide, not just New York. And the problem was that horses lost training time, and then due to a number of complex issues that involved economics and population epidemiologic factors with the pandemic, that these horses just didn't get the appropriate training earlier in their careers, and they never had a chance to catch up. And when they were put into racing competitions, by mid-July at Saratoga, at least, and certainly in other jurisdictions as well, that there was an increased fatality rate because of that. We've known about this issue of training 2-year-olds for many years now, but it just is one more natural fact. It was a freak of nature here that happened. It was not anything anyone intended, but it certainly validates our assumptions and our belief that these young horses need a certain amount of high-speed furlongs under their belt before they get to the races, and there has to be sufficient time between those high-speed furlong events to allow for the proper modeling of bone to take place. You can't just put it all in together in a short period of time and expect it to work. We did have a notation here that we're slightly above the national fatality rate. I haven't run a statistical comparison on it yet, but it was pretty small. It was 1.39 was the national rate, 1.53 was the mid-Atlantic rate, but they're close, but I still don't, we use that as a metric. I just don't like to see us get above that national rate. So we need to work on that. And then I want to point out also something interesting in 20 and 21. I don't have data for all the jurisdictions. I do have data for both New York and Maryland. And the number of cardiac related, if you will, or presumed cardiac related sudden deaths decreased dramatically in these two jurisdictions in the past year. This corresponded with a change in the regulation of the use of thyroxine at our racetracks. It has been basically declared a prohibited substance. It can be used if a therapeutic use exemption is granted. Now, what that means is that if a trainer or a veterinarian has a horse that they can prove to the commission that they really are hypothyroid, they're by all means, the horses can be treated. But the criteria for granting that therapeutic use exemption is no longer a simple T3 or T4 level. And the reason for that is that a couple of years ago, I started looking at this with our horse population in New York and looking at the reports from Cornell University that any horse that was at a T3 or a T4 less than 1 was considered hypothyroid, quote unquote. And so these horses were theoretically then qualified for a therapeutic use exemption. At the time, it wasn't a therapeutic use exemption, but that was the diagnostic criteria for treating these horses with thyroid hormone. Well, working with Tom Divers, we did an informal study. We looked at a lot of horses and just took as many normal horses as we could get and sent the tests up to Cornell. And almost all of these horses were below 1. And so the point is that the normal of 1.0 in thyroid testing for T3 and T4 is not reasonably used in a thoroughbred racehorse. Why? Because there are two things that we know for a fact will decrease the thyroid levels in a racehorse. One of them is exercise. And of course, they get a lot of exercise. And the other is the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And they get a lot of that too. You can see the number of our positive findings. It's the most common positive finding we have is the NSAIDs. And so these two factors in play, we had to rethink what the appropriate use of thyroxine might be. So now we use the thyroid stimulating hormone or response test, if you will, where the veterinarian is required to take a blood sample as a baseline, then administer a stimulating hormone, TSH, to stimulate the thyroid gland. If that test comes back that the second number is way lower than the first number, then the horse truly is hypothyroid and does qualify. But I can tell you in the last 2 years, since this rule was put in place in New York, I've had 5 applications for therapeutic use exemptions, and I did not approve any of them because none of them showed a decrease in the thyroid levels in the blood after the second test was taken. So this is a really important important change, and I know it's only 1 year, but let's have the next slide, Andy. What I did was I looked at the average number of sudden deaths diagnosed as a cardiac issue, a potential cardiac issue. And that's typically a negative diagnosis, and only about 30% of horses do we actually find something in the heart that is meaningful to collaborate the idea that it really was a cardiac issue. But we get backed into that diagnosis in the absence of anything else for the most part. And because the presumption is it's an electrical event that doesn't leave any traces behind. But anyway, 8.2 was the number from 2010 to 2020. And in New York in 2021, we had 3. Now we're monitoring this. That's only 1 year. And that's not that helpful, but it's certainly encouraging and it's got my attention. So I think that it's very important that people in all jurisdictions take a really hard look at thyroid use in the racetracks. And I'm quite convinced it's been abused for quite a long time. Next slide, please.
God, if I could just editorialize on that just for 1 second. That's a textbook example of how our collective work in the region does have an impact when we can identify a problem. I mean, since the New York Task Force report was issued in 2012, we've been laser focused in this region on trying to identify risk factors and those things that might contribute to a equine fatality. And we've been very successful in identifying potential risk factors and trying to address them in a way that will benefit all of us. We saw with a large number of sudden cardiac events that something was amiss. And we believed, although there was some resistance outside the region to our conclusions, that the use of thyroid supplementation was a direct cause. And we had enough information from just barn searches and the work of investigators and otherwise to know that thyroid supplementation was very common in the barn areas at our racetracks. So we issued an advisory. We actually prohibited. It became a national prohibition, and the results speak for themselves. We know we were on the right track. So, we don't make up recommendations when we come to these meetings. They're scientifically and evidence-based. And, if we've missed the mark, we'll tell you that. But if we think we're spot on, as we do here, this is an example of how our work and our work in the region collectively can have an impact on our industry nationally.
Okay, I wanted to just move on to something a little different now. We're not going to talk so much about what's happened in the past, but I think there's some tools that we can use to do better in the future in terms of monitoring our fatality rates. Now, we know that the use of total numbers of fatalities it's a body count, and that's the favorite number of the critics of horse racing. And it's a favorite number because, first of all, it is a number that people relate to because it is a body count. They don't like body counts, and they're familiar with, all the issues with the Vietnam War and everything thereafter. We're very sensitive to this kind of thing. And so that total number, while emotional and very, used by a lot of people for certain agenda-driven programs, I think that it makes more sense and it's more honest for us in the industry to be looking at incident rates and putting things in perspective. And for example, for a long time now, since the EID was started, we've been looking at racing fatalities, and we don't just publish total numbers. We do in New York, they're on our website, but we also calculate the incidence rate by looking at the number of fatalities per 1,000 starts. It's a baseline. It's a standardization of the data so that it takes into account changes in the number of starts. It's a denominator. Okay, basically take the racing fatalities, divide by the number of starts, and you get a number that basically corrects for inaccuracies that could be related to changes in the number of starts. Now, the EID does not do that for training fatalities, and there's some reasons for that, but I found it helpful in New York to look at training fatalities and for a denominator using the number of official timed workouts. Now, there's always some challenges or limitations of whatever metric you're using. And some might argue that, well, some fatalities occur when the horses are not actually doing official time workouts. They're galloping out there and they're getting a humeral fracture. I mean, these stress fractures are the principal ones. But I would admit that that does occasionally happen. I would also submit to you, though, that in the EID, the racing fatality rate is calculated on racing fatalities that occur within 72 hours of a race. And I can assure you that there are a lot of fatalities that are related to racing injuries that happen farther out than that, but are not counted. So I'm just saying it's not, these things are never perfect, but I think they do have a standardized value that can be used from year to year and time to time to make comparisons. The other fatalities, these are the non-exercise related fatalities. And the way these things are standardized, this is not news. This is something that's done in people where they look at fatalities in a human population. Basically what they do here is you take the number of horses that are at the racetrack for a given year or period of time, and then you figure out how many days they're there, and you can calculate things called a horse day, and that's a metric. So the horse days relate to the population density of the racetrack. So if a racetrack has a lot of horses on it, they're going to have a higher number of horse days. If they have a longer meet, they're going to have a higher number of horse days, and vice versa. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is an overall annual mortality rate that is something that caught my attention this year that I think is just interesting to talk about. Next slide, please, Andy. So I just wanted to show you, I don't have the data to calculate incidence rates for all these fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region, except for the racing fatalities, which we've been doing for many years. So, but I do have the data to do this for New York. And I am indebted to the Jockey Club, and this is something that this data is available, as is true in all of these things that we're doing to get good metrics, to monitor our risk management programs. I mean, it's very important to have data, and we can get data from the Jockey Club. This data is readily available to the tracks, but it's not easy to get. It's just not in one easy place to find it. So one of the things we need to do, and I'm confident this will happen with HESA, is that this data will be readily available to people to do these calculations. Now, why is this interesting, or why should we bother with this? Well, one of the things is I've gotten a lot of questions over the years about how come our training fatality rate in New York is so much higher than our racing fatality rate? And the fact is they're looking at raw numbers. And it's just the fact of the matter is, for example, look at 2021 in New York. We had 27 racing fatalities. We had 36 training fatalities. Now, does that mean to a layman who's just looking at raw numbers, they're going to say, well, wow, this training is more dangerous than racing. But in actual fact, that's not true, because we had 19,590 starts in New York, and we had 52,551 official time workouts. And so when you look at these numbers, the fatality rate in New York this year was 1.38. The training fatality rate was 0.69. That's half as much. Okay, so this gives us, and that's fairly consistent. If you look, across these from 2017 to 21, it's pretty consistent. So I think we can reasonably say that training the training fatality rates are only about half of what the racing fatality rates are. They're not more. It's half as much. And why is it half as much? Well, first of all, they don't go as fast. A race horse is going at about 12 meters per furlong. A training horse breezing generally goes around 13 seconds per furlong. So they're going a little bit slower, and they don't go as far. Our races are never shorter than 5.5 furlongs. They're generally between 6 and 8 furlongs for the most part. But the point is that when people train, they generally train 3 furlongs or 4 furlongs, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but rarely. So they don't go as far, they don't go as fast. It's reasonable then to assume that the fatality rate would be less. And in fact, it is. Without this kind of data, you can't say that with certainty, but we can. And now let's look at our other fatality rates. 25 horses died in New York last year related to non-exercise events in the barn area. How many horses, in terms of horse days, that's 71,708 horse days in Finger Lakes and NYRA racetracks. That's a fatality rate of 0.35, half the training fatality rate. So ironically, it's pretty consistent from year to year. And so what you can see is, in broad terms, we can say with confidence that the fatality rate in racehorses is what it is. That's our baseline. Training rate's about half of that, and the non-exercise related is about half of that. So the point is that this is an accurate way to really monitor these fatality incidence rates and enable us to target interventions specifically to address those particular numbers. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, this is an interesting one. How many times have you heard people who are attacking the horse racing industry say horses are just dying so quickly. They're dying. It's a killing field in these racetracks. They're dying like crazy. We got to stop the killing, right? And I often thought, and I'm not justifying that. All of you that know me know that I'm totally dedicated to saving horses' lives and improving mortality rates. It's the only thing I've done for the last 8 years. And I can tell you that I'm totally committed to that. But one of the things that people have to realize is that horses die. Horses die in the stall, they die on the racetrack, they die in the field. But the question really is, do they die more at the racetrack? And if they do, how much more? What are we talking about here? Do horses at the racetrack die 3 times as much as horses that are out in the field somewhere in the countryside? I mean, do they? I didn't know. And I'd challenge any of you to say the same. But what I came up with, I did find a way that I looked at some data that was done by the US Department of Agriculture. And here, the next slide, please, Andy. And what they did was they have something called an overall annual mortality rate, and it's a survey. So the data is not as good as our racing data because we've got really good data at the racetracks. But in this survey, what the USDA did was they surveyed horse owners all over the country, and they asked them things like, how many horses do you have on your farm? How many horses died this year? And they used information like that to calculate what they called an overall annual mortality rate. And what they do is they took the total number of fatalities and divided it by the total number of horses that were in the farm or wherever. And so interestingly, what I did was I did this for New York, and I looked at the number of horses that were actually stabled at the racetrack. Now, granted, you can have ship-ins coming in and out once in a while, but again, we're looking for basically a baseline data here that gives some reference point to us. But I took the total number of fatalities for all causes. That means racing, training, or non-exercise related. I divided it by the number of horses, and that gives you the overall mortality rate. And as you can see, it varied from 2% to 1.5%. The average, the mean for this 5-year period was 1.7%. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, interestingly, this fatality rate, this overall annual mortality rate for all equids, that means horses, donkeys, mules, right? Living on farms in the United States, that's 28 states, was 1.4% in the study that was performed in 2015. They don't do it every year. They did one other one in 1989, and the fatality rate in that year was 1.5. So let's just say in New York, we're averaging 1.7. So the difference in the annual mortality rate at our racetracks in New York is 0.3% greater than that of every donkey, mule, and horse living on a farm in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that's good, better, and different, but I am telling you that this gives us a reference point to look at. And I think that it's a reasonable thing to think that we ought to be, look at this on an annual basis and see if we can compare with the USDA numbers. And what it does, it says, yeah, okay, we are, 0.2% higher. And you know what? We have a very good success rate. When you look at the Mid-Atlantic total number of fatalities in 2021, if you calculate that out and turn it from the number of starts into a percentage, what that means is that 99.85% of every start in the Mid-Atlantic region in 2021 was completed without a fatality, 99.85%. What that means is that we're spending, really across the country, we're spending millions of dollars and spending enormous amounts of research efforts on eliminating the last 0.15%. And one might say, well, it's worth it, and it is worth it, and we all believe that. But I want to tell you that I challenge almost any industry in any kind of statistical analysis. If they are 99.85% successful in what they do, I think that's a substantial number to think about and to consider when people are telling us that we're operating killing fields at the racetrack. So I would offer that as something to be thinking about as we go forward. I think that's about it for me, Andy. Yep. Yep, that's it.
Let's go to your Stride Safe report and follow up from the November meeting.
Okay. Do we want to see if there are any questions? Do we have any questions from the group? Could raise your hand. Nope, don't see anything.
Okay. We know that we've decreased fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region quite effectively. Next slide, Landy, please. So this is just a little bit redundant, but again, over the last 12 years, we've really substantially decreased the number of equine fatalities in the Mid-Atlantic region. And we did that using evidence-based risk management, okay? We also, all of this work was based upon subjective data. What that means is when we examine horses before a race, when we examine them after a race, when we look at horses on the vets list, or how do they go on the vets list? How do they get off the vets list? All of these tools that we use for evaluating lameness in horses or unsoundness is subjective data. These are physical examinations by human beings. And if you got 3 or 4 veterinarians to look at almost any given horse, not in a really extreme case, but a lot of the horses are only mildly lame. Some of them would say the horse is lame. Some of them would say the horse is not lame. When we do a test in New York, when the horses come to the test barn after a claiming race, I can tell you that it's not infrequent that there'll be some discussion about, is that horse lame or is that horse not lame? So subjective data is great. And, you know, it's very useful, particularly in you know, basically fairly obvious situations. We talk about the AP lameness grading scale, you know, grade 2 or more, you get pretty obvious, but the grade 1s and grades 2, you know, are kind of hard to pick apart. And so those are great tools, but they are subjective. Let's move on, Andy. So I believe that the way forward for us to actually do better in reducing fatalities is really early recognition of horses that are unsound before they are so obvious that we can see them on a subjective lameness exam. We need objective data to do that. So I think that the other thing, you know, that there's millions of dollars being spent around the country right now looking at novel imaging technology, PET scans in particular, and CAT scans, and the combination of the two. And these are terrific, terrific diagnostic tools. They're pretty poor scanning tools. You know, we talk about using the scanning tools or you know, screening tools, but they're really not that great for that, not because they're not accurate. A good screening tool has got to be affordable, readily available, and accurate. And CAT scans and PET scans are absolutely accurate. They're the best we've got, but they are not readily affordable and they're not readily available. You know, they're not scalable. You know, you can't sound in a CAT scan every horse that races. We need technology that we can put every horse that races and be able to get some information from that device that'll help steer us, find out which horses need to be PET scanned, which horses need a CAT scan. I want you to think about this as kind of like a mammography stepwise process where there's mammography screening that then leads to other diagnostic tests. We don't do biopsies in every woman that goes in to see if they got a breast tumor. That's ridiculous. And so the same thing applies here, that we need a screening device to get us to the imaging in an efficient way to do that. Next slide, please, Andy. So this is a group of people that's worked on this for a long time, not me. I'm late to the party. I've only been working on this for about a year now, but it's a group of people that's done a lot of work on horses' gait analysis using some very sophisticated technology. Next slide, please. Biometrics devices. These are Fitbits, basically. You know, what it is a very sophisticated device that tells us a lot about horses' gait that is impossible to see by any other means. Next slide, please. This is the size of a small cell phone, and it fits in the saddle cloth of the racehorse. There are no wires attached to the horse. This is slipped right into the saddle cloth, just like the Tracus device. The Tracus device is a device that gives you an idea about where the horse is on the racetrack, and you see him on the tote boards. There's little chiclets on the bottom of the screen. All of the devices that are used right now are accurate to about 1 meter in terms of their accuracy. This device is accurate to 10 centimeters. That's a huge difference. In other words, these sensors will transmit to a satellite. We know where that sensor is. We know where that little device is within 10 centimeters, up, down, left to right, side to side, going front to back. So it measures acceleration, not speed. Acceleration is a change in speed. So it measures changes in speed, either in the longitudinal front to back direction, or the up and down direction, that's vertical, or medial to lateral, that's side to side. And it does that 800 times a second. And all that data is transmitted to a satellite, downloaded to a computer, and then we get a readout from that. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about the equine gallop in a little bit different way. We've all seen slow motion pictures of horses racing and galloping. And it's a beautiful thing to watch, and it sure looks complicated. because it's sometimes you got 1 foot on the ground, sometimes you got 3 feet on the ground, sometimes you got no feet on the ground. And what I like about this program is that this algorithm breaks the gallop down into 3 phases. The first phase of the stride is the hind limb stance phase. That's when either 1 or 2 hind limbs are loaded. And think of these hind limbs as gigantic springs. So we're going to load those springs during the stance phase. The horse's hips are going to drop down a little bit, compress, and then what happens? During the second phase of the stride, the horse is driving forward and landing on the forelimbs. That's called the forelimb stance phase. And that's when you catch the weight of the horse. Throwing it forward off the springs, you catch it on the front legs. The third final phase of the stride is the period of suspension. That's where the horse takes a breath. And this is important. This is where that horse adjusts their body in the air to optimize landing for the next stride. Now, if everything's all well and good, they don't do much adjusting, but they can't adjust their body once it's on the ground. They can't change the load once it's on the ground, but they can, while they're in the air, move their axial skeleton in such a way that they can maybe go a little bit lighter on that landing or switch a lead or whatever to help reduce pain that might be related to a subclinical lameness. Next slide, please. So I just want you to look on the left-hand side here. We see the 3 vectors here. You have longitudinal, and we have vertical, and we have side-to-side, medial-lateral. And notice that during the hind limb stance phase, as you can see here with the horse coming down the stretch at Belmont, we've got a fairly synchronized graph here of the different acceleration phases. Now let's have the next slide, please. This is the forelimb stance phase. This is the landing, catching all that weight from the hind end. And you can see things are very different here than they were in the loading phase. And let's go to the last phase, please, Andy. Next slide. And this is the period of suspension when the horse is in the air. Now look at how synchronized all these vectors are when the horse is flying through the air. So they're very different. But anyway, the computer looks at all these peaks and knows where they're supposed to be and knows what the amplitudes are supposed to look like and knows what the relationships are. Next slide, please. So we get a computer report that either says green, red, or yellow. And the green alert means that the horse is basically consistent. That stride and that pattern is consistent with elite sound race horses for the most part. And we can also, as we get data on more horses, we can compare an individual horse to his previous races, which is the best baseline. The yellow alert is when you have a standard, more than a standard deviation of 2 from the baseline. And a red alert is a horse that has a standard deviation of at least 3 from the baseline. Now, anything in science, if it's 3 standard deviations away from the average, it's so far off the scale that there's no possible way that could be attributed to a random event. Next slide, please. So this is what these things look like. Basically, the solid green line here is the total power of the race. Now, this is smooth data. You don't have a point here you don't have 800 points here per second. They average it over 10 seconds. So you can actually see a line instead of a crazy amount of up and down displacement. So you've got this solid green line. The 1 standard deviation above and below is the dotted green line. Seconds is the baseline. This is throughout a race. Next one, please, Andy. Now, this is the same horse. We've got a baseline. We've got a green line here. We got a yellow line. Now you can see the yellow line is slightly above the 1 standard deviation from the baseline. So this is a horse that is not exactly normal, but it's worth looking at this horse, but nothing too serious going on here at this point. Next slide, Andy. Now this is another race where the horse has got a red flag alert, and this horse is way off the line. He's very far outside of the normal range, and this is a horse that deserves some immediate veterinary scrutiny. Next slide, please, Andy. So these individual charts where we measure total power, that's the amount of energy that the horse is putting into the race. How much effort is the horse putting forward? Vibration, that's the concussion the horse is experiencing in the race. That's the penalty they pay for the power. The more power, the more concussion, the more vibration. Dorsiventral charts show the up and down movement of the horse. If a horse's springs in the back are not working properly, then there is very little up and down acceleration. That's a problem. And you can see that on these horses by looking at that. Longitudinal just changes in forward acceleration. The most important thing here is that we can see horses that are moving forward in the race, and we can see horses that are decelerating, especially rapidly if something happens. Medial to lateral is the balance from left to right. Next slide, please, Andy. I want to share with you an interesting case study of a horse at Saratoga this summer. And what you see here is that this was the beginning of the study, and we did not have enough data to have a real big population number to look as a baseline. So what you're seeing here is the blue line and the dotted lines is the initial number of horses that we had to work with were pretty small. So it's a pretty wide standard deviation relative to the baseline, but you can see the horse in this particular race, this was a 6.5 furlong race. It was a grade 2 race at Saratoga. And the horse was fairly well in the normal range for total power and total vibration. Nothing too exciting here. Next slide, please, Andy. The dorsal ventral, notice in the dorsal ventral graph, though, this horse was way below the mean throughout the whole race. And in particular, between 50 and 60 seconds, this horse was way below. Something is particularly going on there. The longitudinal acceleration, if you look at this one, look at about accelerating pretty aggressively up until around 58 seconds. Then the horse rapidly decelerates from around 58 to 62 seconds. And if we go over and look at the medial to lateral forces, we can see this horse was never in the baseline really, and had 2 major events where the horse was way out of balance. And one of them was somewhere around 35 to 40 seconds, and then a real big one at around 58. So look at that 58 second period, or the 55 to 58 second period. Something seriously wrong was going on here. Now this horse, I want to emphasize, this horse finished the race in second place by a head. The jockey was ecstatic, thought it was a great race. The trainer was ecstatic, thought it was a great race. But they didn't have access to this information. Nobody did, and we didn't even at the time have that information. So this horse goes back to the test barn. It walks about a quarter mile from the unsaddling area back to the test barn for blood tests after the race and blood and urine. So when it gets back there, as it's cooling out, the horse starts to become lame. The horse was so lame in the test barn, it had to be vanned back to its stable to be examined by a veterinarian. When it got back there, the horse was very lame. They examined, next slide, please, Andy. And they radiographed it. And this horse had, in that race, developed an acute sagittal fracture of the right third carpal bone. Now this, we know exactly when this happened, and it's only because that technology can see things that nobody else can see. And it's just really remarkable. Next slide, please, Andy. So that's an anecdotal comment. That's a single horse, and we don't make decisions based on anecdotal information. And repeated anecdotal incidents is not a controlled study. So we needed to look at this a little bit in depth to figure out what was going on. The first question really was, can we use this technology at a very high tempo racetrack? And is it going to be disruptive? I mean, can we get these sensors into the saddle cloths? Can we download the data? Can we get good information? Can we make decisions based on that? And we found a couple of things. First of all, we were able to get data. We were able to put these sensors in the saddle cloths, and we got good information. We also found that we were able to get a very good tight fingerprint of the Saratoga main track, the dirt track. That's because we had more than 250 horses run over it, and we could see a fingerprint for that racetrack. Very important, because we can not only use this data to identify horses at risk of injury, we can also use it to figure out if there's any problems on the racetrack. Because frankly, where a horse really gets injured on a racetrack is not usually where they come up on the charts. A horse pulls up at the 8th pole. That's not typically where he gets injured. He's injured a long time before that. Depends on how long it takes to pull him up, or he'll decelerate, whatever. But this tells us if there is a problem on the racetrack, we know we're looking at the right part of the racetrack. In this group of horses, there were 3% of them had a red alert. And in some cases, it correlated with pre-race inspection abnormal findings and/or high-speed exercise anomalies that I could identify with an algorithm that we use with the Jockey Club to examine their exercise history and data. We certainly felt like, though, we needed to answer a couple of questions like, what are we really measuring here? And also, can we get a series of individual fingerprints from horses and fine-tune the alert sensitivity and specificity? Next slide, Andy. So this, to my knowledge, is the first time that biometric sensors have ever been looked at in a prospective and longitudinal fashion to find out what are we measuring. Okay, so we know that from analyzing this data that there was a very significant difference between the horses that had these different categorizations, red, yellow, or green. we also use this Fisher exact test of independence is used to compare proportions of populations to means of proportions of population, see if there's a difference. So for example, what we found here is one of our outcome, there are 7 outcome criteria we looked at. This is only one, but it's an important one. This is we looked at these horses, followed them for 4 months after the Saratoga races and said, basically asked the question, did these horses come back and race again within 4 months? Now, the first time this technology was ever used was in Washington State at Emerald Downs Racetrack. And I had the data from Emerald Downs and looked at that, but the challenge was that Emerald Downs shuts down, and at that point, nothing happens there for 6 months. So everybody, all the horses got 6 months off. Well, at Saratoga, at the end of the Saratoga meet on Labor Day, these horses don't go on vacation. They usually go on and do something else. They may not be all going to the Breeders' Cup, but they're going on to race or do something. So what we did, we looked at whether or not these horses were able to come back and race again within 4 months of leaving the Saratoga meet. What we found was that the red horses with red alerts, only 40% of them were able to come back and race within 4 months. The yellow horses, 72% came back and raced within 4 months. The green horses, 78% came back and raced within 4 months. An enormous significant difference between the green and the red. Now the yellow and the green are not significantly different, but we can say categorically horses with red alerts are very likely not to come back and race for 4 months after they get that red alert. And that's the first time we've ever been able to get data like this that really shows that we are measuring something very significant. Now, one might argue that, well, horses can be out of training for a couple of different reasons. It's not always because they're lame, but let's think about that for a second. Next slide, please, Andy. So we know that most of these red horses didn't make it back to race for 4 months. We know that pre-existing musculoskeletal abnormalities are found in most horses with catastrophic injuries. We also know that lameness is an overt gait abnormality and is the #1 cause of attrition in thoroughbred racehorses. And what we can conclude from all this is that these wearable sensors are able to detect subtle gait abnormalities, parentheses, early signs of lameness, before overt clinical signs are apparent. That is huge. Next slide, please, Andy. So then from there we went down to Belmont, and at this point we were only able to measure 1 race a day at Saratoga. We measured every horse in every race at the Belmont Fall Meet and the Aqueduct Winter Meet. At this point, we've got thousands of horses to look at. We have good data on multiple racetracks. We've got good data on horses that if we got multiple races on them to track them over time and see what happens to them. And we've been able to refine the algorithms to make them more sensitive and more specific. Next slide, please. This is an example of a horse from the Belmont Fall Meet. And the red line on the bottom is a race that took place on the 30th of October in 2021. And the other races that are above that, the other different colors, are just previous races. You can see there's a fair amount of consistency in dorsal ventral forces. There's a little bit more differences in the longitudinal forces. Medial lateral, there's a lot going on there, but notice how different this red race was. And so this gives you an example of how you can take a current race and compare it with a history of previous races, okay? And it's really important to be able to do that because this is that horse's individual baseline, his fingerprint, if you will, of what he looks like when he's going fast. And so this particular horse, I called the trainer and I said to him, I said, you know, we've got a red alert on your horse the other day. And I said, I really feel obliged to let you know about that because horses that get red alerts generally don't come back and do well for a while. And often is a reason is that is unsoundness. I said, have you had any unsoundness with this horse? And he said, well, not really, Doc. He said, not that I could tell, but he's a pretty lousy racehorse. He seemed to be getting worse over time. So this last race that he had was just terrible. And you can see he's underpowered in all areas. So he's not going fast. He's not pushing off his springs. And his medial lateral forces, while they're fairly uniform, are consistently displaced one side against the other. So this is a horse that may just be a little bit off, but basically he's not a very talented horse either. He's either not trying or he's not protecting himself. So it's an example of how this is why we need to be very specific about what we're measuring. And it's important that we continue to refine this program to make it better and better as time goes on. Next slide, please. So conclusion, bottom line, this technology has great promise. to provide a practical and scalable screening tool to detect subtle gait abnormalities before the overt clinical signs of lameness are evident. Early diagnosis and timely intervention can help keep these horses in training in a safe manner and prevent career-ending or catastrophic injury. Another really important thing I want to point out here is that the relationship between a regulatory veterinarian and a trainer is generally adversarial. And that's because we're working at the far end of the scale. By the time the adversarial situation comes, because the trainer puts a horse in to run and a regulatory veterinarian looks at it and says, not today. That's a problem for both people, okay? This technology gives us the opportunity to start a conversation way before things get to that level and gives us the opportunity to intervene in a positive way. It makes it a team effort between regulatory veterinarians and trainers and attending veterinarians, so we can all work together to help these horses get squared away before they get seriously injured. And I'm confident that when we get this used in widespread use, it's going to give us more horses in the starting gate. It's going to improve our ability to prevent catastrophic injury, and it'll help our industry in general be more economically sufficient. Next slide, Andy, please. So as late as March 25th in 2021 in the Mid-Atlantic region, the Philadelphia Inquirer had a terrible article in there about slamming horse racing, but talking about the killing is built into the system. Now we know that it isn't built into the system. We know that because for the last 10 years, we've been able to reduce the fatality rate by almost 40% because there's stuff that we can do. And if we can do that better, we're going to do better. But this gives us the potential to take this all to a whole nother level. I think if let's next slide, please, Andy. Instead of talking about the killing fields, it gives us the opportunity to say things like thoroughbred horse racing is now using state-of-the-art biometric sensor technology to take horse and rider safety to the next level. That's the truth. And it also changes the narrative. I'm sure many of you watched some playoff football games in the NFL this past fall. I couldn't watch a single playoff game without a commercial in there by the NFL talking about all the great work they're doing and with biometric sensors and research and concussion management and concussion protocols. We can do the same thing with horse racing, and that's an invaluable asset. Next slide, Andy. Questions?
We have a question from Kathy Anderson. Go ahead, Kathy.
So Scott, excellent presentation. It's every time I hear it, it just gets a little better. The question I had was on your almost near the end of your slides, just before your conclusion on the individual footprint of the Belmont Park horse.
Right.
And I noticed that it seemed to be, as you said, the red line was notably lower than the other. However, my question is, it didn't seem to be terribly, it didn't have a lot of blips. And is it possible that you will also find in these fingerprints poor performance related to respiratory function, either bleeding or actual function, or metabolic function? And if so, is that another avenue that can be explored down the road for safety and health of horses?
Absolutely so, Kathy. There's no question about that poor performance or EIPH or whatever. Remember, I mentioned to you that we have high power reds and we have low power reds. And I showed you some high power reds in another horse. This is a low power red. And these low power reds mean one of two things. One is either the horse just can't do it or the horse doesn't want to do it. This horse was not putting out much of an effort during this race. And was that because the horse couldn't, or was that because it was bleeding? Was that because it just was protecting itself because it was afraid of pain, feeling pain? So that's very, very true. And I don't think we have enough data, Kathy. What we're doing right now is, as I said, we've got thousands of horses now that we're looking at. We're going to do follow-up on every single one of them. And it's a ton of work, but that's how we're going to get that data. That's how I got this data. I called up that trainer. I said, is anything wrong with this horse? He said, no, he's just a lousy racehorse. So, that to me was important information, because this was a red alert. That doesn't mean he's going to get hurt when he goes out the next time. It just means that he needs to be looked at and evaluated. And I think that's the key thing, Kathy, is that this starts the conversation. This is a flag. And what it does is I've got we're only at the point now where I've actually got a preliminary report that I can email out to the trainers. We have to automate this so it can happen quickly and efficiently, because one person can't do this. It's a full-time job to follow up on these horses and just get the data done and contact these people. And you know how hard it is to get somebody on the phone sometimes. So, I mean, it's an enormous amount of work. We have to streamline it, make it efficient. But the idea being this report doesn't say that your horse is going to go get hurt if it goes out and runs again. What it says is that these red alert horses are shown not to make it back to work in an efficient manner and what you would normally expect. So something's going on. Please have your veterinarian look at this horse. And that's the key here. And that gets the attending veterinarian into this discussion early in the process. And that's when you say, well, you know what? We scoped that horse the other day and he did bleed. That's probably part of this. You know, and that's really important, Kathy. And certainly when you think about it, a subclinical neurologic condition like EPM would show up a lot, maybe a lot like something like this. So, I mean, they're diagnostics. This is not a diagnostic test, but it is a great screening tool that gets these horses looked at by veterinarians early in the process, so a diagnosis can be made, and, you know, hopefully good things can come from that.
Yeah, I see it being very valuable for multiple reasons.